Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
Have you ever heard of two football firms from cities more than 200 miles apart forming an alliance that would last for decades? In a world where loyalty to your own club and your own city was everything, friendships between rival groups were rare. Yet somehow, one of the most enduring alliances in British football supporter culture developed between Hibernian's capital city service and Oldham Athletic's fine young casuals. Their connection would span more than 3 decades, stretching from the late 1980s into the modern era, with both groups appearing together at matches across Britain. But how did this unlikely friendship begin? And why has it remained such a well-known part of football folklore? The story can be traced back to the late 1980s, when links first began to develop between Hibs capital city service and Oldham lads. Around 1987 and 1988, cross-border travel, pre-season fixtures, and overlapping friendships within the wider British casual scene brought people from the two clubs together. Despite the considerable distance between Edinburgh and Greater Manchester, the relationship continued to grow. Mutual visits became common, supporters travelled to matches together, and over the years, the alliance became one of the most talked about friendships in football supporter culture. One of the earliest first-hand accounts comes from the summer of 1988, when Hibernian arranged a pre-season tour of England. The trip included fixtures against Walsall, Bury, and finally Oldham Athletic. According to one participant, the opening matches produced little of note. At Walsall, only a small number of capital city service members made the journey, while a handful of Rangers supporters exchanged insults from inside the ground. Bury proved equally uneventful, with little organised opposition present. Everything changed when the tour reached Oldham. The fixture, played on Saturday 6 August 1988, allowed a much larger travelling contingent to make the journey south. Around 200 Hibs supporters travelled by car and rail. One account recalls arriving in Manchester after discovering there was no direct service from Edinburgh to Oldham, with many of the travelling supporters gathering in the city before making their way towards the match. Before heading to Boundary Park, several Hibs supporters met individuals from Oldham whom they already knew through football. Those contacts offered to show them where they might find Manchester City supporters in the city centre. After searching a number of pubs, they eventually located a group inside the Brunswick Cellars. Contemporary accounts describe the venue as a basement bar with only a single entrance, making it difficult to leave once trouble began. What followed was a violent confrontation that caused significant damage inside the premises before the group dispersed and continued towards Oldham. However, events took an unexpected turn once they reached Boundary Park. While part of the Hibernian contingent had remained in Manchester, younger members of the travelling group, often referred to as the baby crew, had already encountered Oldham supporters outside the ground. Despite reportedly putting up determined resistance, they had come off second best in the confrontation. At the time, some Oldham supporters believed they had defeated Hibs' main travelling group, rather than a smaller contingent. As word spread through the arriving Hibernian supporters, tensions rose considerably. What had begun as a routine pre-season fixture suddenly carried a far more personal edge. According to eyewitness accounts, police quickly recognised the mood among the visiting supporters. As the match approached its conclusion, officers attempted to keep the groups apart by securing the exits behind the away section. The plan appeared straightforward: contain the away supporters until the streets outside had cleared. But it didn't unfold as intended. Accounts from those present describe supporters pushing against the barriers, preventing the exits from being fully secured. Even after leaving the terracing, they found another obstacle waiting for them. Large wooden gates blocked the route outside the stadium, making escape or movement almost impossible. For a short period, it appeared that the police operation had succeeded. Outside the ground, however, taunts continued to be exchanged between the two sets of supporters. According to later recollections, the atmosphere became increasingly heated before the crowd surged against the wooden gates. Eventually, the barriers gave way, leading to further disorder outside the stadium, before police regained control. Although accounts differ on precisely what happened next, it is clear that the confrontation left a lasting impression on everyone involved. What makes this story particularly remarkable is not the confrontation itself, but what happened afterwards. Instead of allowing that day to create a permanent rivalry, the relationship between the two groups gradually changed. Over time, previous hostility gave way to mutual respect, and before long, supporters from Hibernian and Oldham were travelling together to fixtures across Britain. As one former participant later reflected, they never allowed one confrontation to define the relationship. In many ways, that sentence explains why this alliance became so unusual. Over the following decades, Hibs and Oldham supporters would appear together at numerous matches involving clubs from England and Scotland, building a reputation for travelling together far beyond their own fixtures. Even today, supporters continue to remember how that friendship first developed. One viewer recently commented, "Our lad, who recently passed away, was one of the ones who started our friendship with Hibs back in 1987. He loved the Hibs lads, and many of them would always stay at his house whenever they came down." Another simply wrote, "Been friends with Hibs since the 80s. Others pointed towards connections that extended beyond football itself. One viewer mentioned the late Andy Gorham, writing, "Andy Gorham, the legend, R.I.P. There was a connection between Hibs and Oldham through the goalie. Whether every story has become embellished over time is open to debate. But what is beyond question is that, by the early 1990s, the friendship between Hibs and Oldham had become firmly established. It would continue to surface in police reports, newspaper articles, and supporter recollections for decades afterwards. And one incident in particular, more than 30 years after those first meetings, demonstrated that the alliance had not disappeared. It had simply endured. The years passed, football changed, policing evolved, and many of the familiar faces from the 1980s disappeared from the scene. Yet reports linking Hibernian and Oldham supporters continued to emerge. Whether travelling to league matches, pre-season friendlies, or games involving other clubs, the alliance repeatedly appeared in newspaper reports and supporter recollections, suggesting it had survived long after many expected it to fade. One of the most widely reported modern examples came on Saturday, the 23rd October 2021 in Carlisle. On that afternoon, Oldham Athletic were playing Carlisle United, while a number of Hibernian supporters had also travelled south. According to reports presented later in court, supporters from Hibs had met with Oldham fans at a nearby pub before making their way through the city centre together. At the same time, a group of Celtic firm were inside Gallagher's Irish bar, drinking and playing pool. Prosecutors later told the court there was no evidence that the confrontation had been pre-arranged, although they suggested there was some pre-existing enmity between the rival groups. Whatever the circumstances, CCTV showed the two groups becoming aware of one another's presence before disorder broke out. I will play that footage for you now. The violence unfolded quickly. Court proceedings heard that punches were thrown, pint glasses were used as missiles, and pool cues became improvised weapons. Pool balls were also thrown during the disturbance, while one smashed through a window, showering broken glass onto a police officer outside. The publican and staff later described the aftermath inside the premises as scenes of complete destruction. Broken glass covered the floor. Snapped pool cues and scattered pool balls littered the corridor, while furniture had been damaged during the confrontation. Customers who had simply gone out for a drink found themselves caught in the middle. Among those inside were mothers with young children, elderly customers, and other members of the public who had no connection to football. One man in his 70s reportedly became so distressed that he broke down in tears. A child, believed to have been between 5 and 7 years old, had to be removed from the premises for safety. The landlord's partner later told the court that once the disorder ended, some Celtic supporters celebrated together, hugging, cheering and chanting, comparing it to football supporters celebrating a goal. Police officers who had been following the Hibernian group responded quickly, restoring order before escorting those involved away from the area. In the months that followed, several men from both groups appeared before Carlisle Crown Court, where lawyers spoke of their clients' remorse and the impact the incident had had on their families, employment and future. Whether viewed as a reminder of old rivalries or simply an example of tensions spilling over, the incident demonstrated one thing beyond doubt. More than 30 years after the alliance first emerged, reports were still linking Hibs and Oldham supporters together. Had you heard about the Carlisle incident before today? Or was this the first time you'd come across it? Let me know in the comments, because it's one of the clearest modern examples of the friendship still being referenced. But Carlisle wasn't the only occasion on which newspaper reports connected the two groups. Another widely reported incident came during a pre-season fixture involving Bolton Wanderers. Police launched an investigation after disorder broke out around the Middlebrook Retail Park following a goalless draw between Bolton and Hibernian. Reports at the time stated that violence erupted after supporters had been escorted from the stadium during the second half. Greater Manchester Police later confirmed they were working alongside officers from Scotland to identify those involved, using CCTV footage, with football banning orders being considered. Eyewitnesses described disorder spreading through the retail park, with frightened shoppers seeking shelter inside nearby stores as shop fronts were damaged during the disturbance. One landlord recalled locking the doors of his pub before watching events unfold from an upstairs window. He later claimed he had been told that organised groups linked to several clubs, including Oldham, Bolton and Manchester, had intended to confront Hibernian and Celtic lads that day. Elsewhere, reports stated that a group of Hibs supporters returning to a minibus became involved in further disorder after the vehicle was allegedly vandalised. 2 arrests were made following those incidents. Inside the stadium itself, sectarian chanting had already led to supporters being removed before attention shifted to events outside. Following the match, discussions quickly appeared on online supporter message boards. Interestingly, not every Hibs supporter approved of what had happened. One supporter wrote, "To the 98% of Hibs fans, well done, you did your club proud. To the other 2%, you're idiots and belong back in the 1980s. That comment perhaps reflected something football had increasingly experienced by the late 2000s. Many supporters still travelled in large numbers and followed their clubs passionately, but attitudes towards disorder had changed significantly compared with previous decades. The friendship between Hibs and Oldham, however, continued to attract attention whenever their names appeared together in police reports or media coverage. There were also earlier examples. One account recalls an incident at Sunderland's Roker Park in March 1987, where Hibernian supporters were said to have been alongside Oldham followers. After the match, reports describe a series of running confrontations on the route towards the railway station, with further disorder continuing onto the station platforms before police intervened. Other reports point towards Burnley in August 1989. Although definitive evidence placing Oldham supporters alongside Hibernian that day is limited, some accounts have long suggested members of both groups travelled together. Contemporary reports describe clashes in Burnley's town centre before the match, followed by another confrontation close to Turf Moor after the final whistle. By the early 1990s, the alliance had become sufficiently well known that references to Hibs and Oldham travelling together appeared with increasing regularity. One example came in March 1993, when Bolton faced Oldham. According to reports from the time, police intercepted a mixed group of Hibernian and Oldham supporters shortly after they arrived in Bolton. During searches, officers reportedly recovered a number of items that caused concern before escorting the group away from the area. Later that day, further disorder was reported in Manchester city centre before some supporters returned towards Bolton following the match. Police recorded additional incidents after the final whistle, with several arrests made. Taken individually, each of these reports tells only part of the story. Together, they paint a picture of an alliance that repeatedly surfaced across different towns, different decades, and different generations of supporters. Of course, not every meeting between Hibs and Oldham ended with cooperation. Like many long-standing football relationships, there were occasions when the two groups found themselves on opposite sides. Perhaps the most famous example takes us back to that summer afternoon at Boundary Park in 1988. While many people remember the friendship that eventually developed, it's easy to forget that one of the defining moments in its history actually began with the two groups clashing with each other before mutual respect gradually replaced hostility. Over the years, reports linking Hibernian and Oldham supporters continued to appear, although, as with much of football supporter history, the available evidence varies. Some incidents are well documented through newspaper archives and court proceedings, while others survive largely through books, eyewitness recollections and stories passed down within supporter circles. As with many aspects of football culture from that era, separating established fact from folklore is not always straightforward. One example frequently referenced in supporter literature concerns Burnley in August 1989, when Hibernian travelled to Turf Moor for a pre-season fixture. Contemporary accounts describe disorder in Burnley town centre before the match, followed by another confrontation close to the stadium after full time. While there is no conclusive evidence confirming Oldham supporters were present alongside Hibs that day, the suggestion has appeared in several accounts over the years and remains part of the wider story surrounding the friendship. Another better documented example came in March 1993, when Bolton Wanderers hosted Oldham Athletic. According to reports from the time, police intercepted a mixed group of Hibernian and Oldham supporters shortly after they arrived in Bolton. Officers carried out searches, and several individuals were prevented from continuing into the town centre. Later that day, further disorder was reported in Manchester before police dealt with additional incidents following the match. A number of arrests were made, adding another chapter to the long list of occasions on which the two clubs were mentioned together. More than a decade later, in 2009, media reports once again linked the two sets of supporters following Bolton Wanderers' pre-season fixture against Hibs. Reports stated that a number of Hibernian supporters were removed from the stadium during the match before disorder later occurred around the Middlebrook retail park. Police investigated damage to shop fronts. One man was taken to hospital and arrests followed. Elsewhere, further incidents were reported near Kearsley railway station, while local newspapers also referred to a Hibernian supporter sustaining a serious ankle injury following a separate confrontation. Taken individually, each incident tells only a small part of the story. Collectively, they demonstrate that references to Hibernian and Oldham travelling together appeared repeatedly over several decades. Sometimes those reports came from court proceedings, sometimes from newspaper coverage, and sometimes from the recollections of supporters themselves. While every account should be viewed in the context of its source, the consistency with which the friendship is mentioned is one of the reasons it has become such a well-known part of football supporter history. It's also worth remembering how much football has changed since many of these events took place. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a very different era. Stadiums have changed beyond recognition. CCTV coverage is extensive. Intelligence-led policing is commonplace, and football banning orders have significantly altered the match day environment. Many of the personalities associated with that period have long since moved on, and the culture that existed around football grounds during those years has largely disappeared. Yet despite those changes, the story of the Hibs and Oldham friendship continues to be discussed. Perhaps that's because it was so unusual. Football rivalries are easy to understand. Friendship between supporter groups from different cities, separated by more than 200 miles, are far less common. The relationship between Hibernian and Oldham has therefore become one of those stories that continues to generate debate, curiosity, and discussion decades after it first emerged. Of course, there are almost certainly many more incidents than the ones covered in this video. Some were reported at the time, others were never formally documented, and many exist only through the memories of those who were there. Like much of football's past, not every story made the newspapers, and not every newspaper report captured the full picture. If you knew about this alliance before watching, I'd be interested to hear what you've heard over the years. And if you've come across newspaper reports, photographs, or first-hand recollections that add to this history, feel free to share them in the comments. The aim is to document an often overlooked part of British football culture as accurately and fairly as possible. You can also now find Everything Casual on Facebook. Just search for Everything Casual and you'll find our page. If you have old photographs, newspaper cuttings, programs, videos, or stories that you think deserve to be preserved, feel free to send me a message. A huge thank you to everyone who has already contributed material and helped build the community around the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.